and this is this is actually our 11th and our final course. We're speaking on the history of marriage and the family this weekend. I think it's a real good course. It's a practical course. I think it's kind of interesting. We're going to begin tonight by talking about the general history of marriage, which relates to what I would call mostly pagan cultures, which would be the overall culture of the world coming throughout history, and how that marriage was understood, and how relationship, as far as couples would be concerned, was understood, and how it functioned. Then we will take a look at Christian marriage throughout history, which means basically from the biblical standpoint, and the church. And then we will take a look finally at the custom in Judaism, which is where we get a lot of our Christian culture from, although the bulk of Christian concepts comes from, obviously, from the Scripture. I think it's an interesting idea that we have to look at. And I also think it's interesting to note, as we go through this in the next 8 hours or so, that Christians didn't necessarily have a lot of contracts and a lot of agreements and a license themselves until just recently. So most things were done by just verbal contract and commitment before God and that type of thing. Legalism, wrong choice of words. Legality. Legality is a relatively new thing that has come into play, and so we're going to talk about that. Most of this beginning section here I've taken from an author by the name of Kuntz, and actually the name of her book is called The History of Marriage. I really enjoyed it, and if you find this topic to be interesting, you would enjoy reading her book, at least the first chapter anyway. The first chapter is probably really, to be honest with you, her first chapter is a synopsis or a summary of her whole book. So if you read the first chapter, you basically have read the whole book. She just goes a little more into depth throughout the rest of the book, but she sums it up in the first chapter. She does a good job. So anyway, everywhere marriage today is becoming more optional and more fragile. Everywhere the once predictable link between marriage and child rearing is beginning to fray. And everywhere relations between men and women are undergoing rapid and at times traumatic transformation. In fact, the relations between men and women have changed more in the past 30 years than they did in the previous 3,000. I know I don't have to tell you this, but we live in a very rapidly changing time. We live in a time where people have taken it upon themselves to design life in the way that they choose to. I mean, people have basically very little morals now. People have very little concern as to what others think. They have very little concern as to what God thinks. And basically, people today just feel like they can do whatever they want in any circumstance. And this is really the way things are happening now. And so marriage has just fallen into that concept, and it's just a free-for-all now. Today, it's almost as common for people not to marry as it is for people to marry. It used to be the divorce rate was just at a steady increase, and now it has begun to taper off a little bit. And for a period of time, researchers thought that we were seeing some improvement until they finally looked again and realized that no, it wasn't improving. People weren't getting married. And when people don't get married, you don't have as high a divorce rate because you can't take it into consideration when you do your surveys, because you're not counting the people who never got married that split up. And when they did compare those statistics with the overall statistics of married people too, they realized that actually the problem was still continuing to grow. That people who were living together, along with people who were married, that there was an increase still going on of people who were cohabitating, we'll put it that way, calling themselves being together as sort of husband and wife, that there was a great increase. And so you can see that the problem has really not gotten better. So I'm convinced that the 1950s Ozzie and Harriet family is not just a post-war aberration, but it is the culmination of a new marriage system that was evolving for more than 150 years. This idea of marrying for love. It's really an interesting concept. What you and I know and consider to be the idea of marrying, marrying for love. We fell in love. We were attracted. We went looking for our dream person. This concept is very new. This is not really the traditional idea of marriage, and that's what we're going to talk about. This new marriage system already showed signs of instability that was to plague it at the end of the 20th century. As soon as the idea that love should be a central reason for marriage, and companionship, its basic goal, was first raised, observers of the day warned that the same values that increased people's satisfaction with marriage as a relationship had an inherent tendency to undermine the stability of marriage as an institution. The very features that promised to make marriage such a unique and treasured personal relationship opened the way for it to become an optional and fragile one. Did you understand that? The very idea that we marry for love opened the way for, now that I don't love you anymore, it opened the way for marriage to become fragile. In other words, if we marry because we love each other, then when we stop loving each other, what's going to happen to the marriage? You see? This is where the idea of divorce began to get out of control. And this is where the instability of marriage began to become such an increasing problem in the previous 150 years up to now. It wasn't nearly considered that a man and a woman would divorce or split up. It wasn't so common. Because they didn't get married because they loved each other. They didn't get married because they were attracted to each other. They got married for other more practical reasons. And how many of you know practical reasons exist? And practical reasons don't just, fly away at a whim like love does. You can burn my toast and I may not love you this morning. Hello? And so when marriage was based on love, all of a sudden people fell out of love. And when they fell out of love, they didn't want to be married anymore. And this is why we have such a problem of divorce today. So for the next 150 years, society struggled to strike the right balance between this goal of finding happiness in marriage and the preservation of limits that would keep people from leaving a marriage that didn't fulfill their expectations for love. So the history of the love-based marriage from the late 18th to the mid-20th century is one of successive crises. As people surged past the barriers that prevented them from achieving marital fulfillment and then pulled back or were pushed back when the institution of marriage seemed to be in jeopardy. Throughout most of history, marriage was not primarily about the individual's needs and desires of a man and a woman and the children they produced. Marriage had as much to do with getting good in-laws and increasing one's family labor force as it did with finding a lifetime companion and raising a beloved child. So, did you understand that? It wasn't so much about, whether these two kids loved each other or not, or thought each other was pretty or not. It was about, we need a bigger labor force. We've got all these fields out here. We've got cows to take care of. So, Billy, when your children get old enough, and my children get old enough, let's just agree right now, we're going to marry these two kids together. Because our fields are joining each other. And if we marry our kids together, then your 40 acres and my 40 acres, we'll have 80 acres in our family. And we'll have a bigger labor force. And, seeing as you have a daughter and I have a son, I'm making all this up, y'all know this. Okay. Then those two can have some grandchildren, and we'll put them grandchildren out in the field. Y'all see what I'm saying? So what have we done? Now Billy and I have 80 acres apiece. Not 160, but 80. Y'all get what I'm saying? Because we're one family now, see? And so we're one family, and now we got more laborers in the field, because now not only do we have his daughter and my son, but now we're fixing to have grandkids. So now we got 80 acres and more laborers in the field. How many of you see what I'm saying? That was the idea right there. And whatever assets Billy had, if Billy had 20 cows and I had 20 cows, now we got 40 cows. Y'all get the point? And that's exactly was how things were approached back then, and that's how they began to think about it. So the previous theories of anthropologists and archaeologists about how marriage came into existence among our Stone Age ancestors, the idea that marriage was invented so men would protect women, and the opposing idea that it was invented so men could exploit women was wrong. See, this is what anthropologists often thought. They thought that back in the Stone Age, oh, gotta give me a woman. Caveman. They thought that it was just something in the nature of a man to take a woman because somehow he felt like he needed to protect woman. That wasn't it at all. Okay? They were actually wrong in those thoughts and those ideas. It was more the idea that that the idea was that instead marriage spoke to the needs of the larger group. It was a group type of an idea. And they discovered all this through their studies and through their investigation in archaeology and anthropology and all these types of sciences. They came to this conclusion later on. It actually converted strangers into relatives and extended cooperative relations beyond the immediate family. As time passed, marriage became a way through which elites could hoard or accumulate resources, shutting out unrelated individuals or even illegitimate family members. Property families consolidated wealth, merged resources, forged political alliances, and concluded peace treaties by strategically marrying off their sons and daughters, even to enemies. Sometimes the perfect way to keep from having to be defeated or destroyed in war was, hey, before you kill me with your bigger tribe or your bigger family, hey, let your son marry my daughter. Let's become family. Well, now here we've got these two families who have their children married. Now we can't kill each other because now we're family. This was another common way of doing things. So when the upper class men and women married, there was an exchange of a dowry, a bride wealth, or a tribute, making the match a major economic investment by the couple's parents and their other kin. In Europe, from the early Middle Ages through the 18th century, the dowry a wife brought with her at marriage was often the biggest infusion of cash, goods, or land a man would ever acquire. Man, I sure got bit. I'm just joking. No, I'm just joking. Finding a husband was usually the most important investment a woman could make in her economic future. Even in the lower classes, marriage was an economic and political transaction. Although on a much smaller scale, the concerns of commoners were more immediate. Things like this. Can I marry someone whose fields are next to mine? Will my prospective mate meet the approval of the neighbors and the relatives on whom I depend? Would these particular in-laws be a help to our family, or would they be a hindrance? Moreover, farms or businesses could rarely be run by just a single person. So a proactive partner's skills, resources, and tools were at least as important as personality and attractiveness. In those days, there were few two-career marriages. Most people had a two-person married couple career that neither one could conduct alone. Traditionally, marriage also organized the division of labor and power by gender and age, confirming men's authority over women and determining if a child had any claim on the property of the parents. Marriage was the most important marker of adulthood, and respectably, as well as the main source of Social Security, medical care, and unemployment insurance. You understand that? In other words, if there was going to be any, it had to come through the means of marriage. You follow? Yeah, okay. Certainly people fell in love during those thousands of years, sometimes even with their own spouse. You get the point? Okay? But marriage was not fundamentally about love. It was too vital an economic and political institution to be entered into solely on the basis of something as traditional as love. For thousands of years, the theme song for most weddings could have been, "What's love got to do with it?" Because marriage was too important a contract to be left up to the two individuals involved, kin, neighbors, and other outsiders such as judges, priests, or government officials were usually involved in negotiating a match. Even when individuals orchestrated their own transitions in and out of marriage, they frequently did so for economic and political advantage rather than love. As a result, many of the greatest love stories of the ages, such as the tale of Antony and Cleopatra, had more to do with political intrigue than romantic passion. The marriages of the rich and famous in the ancient and medieval worlds can be told as political thrillers, corporate mergers, military epics, and occasionally even murder mysteries. But they were not the tales of undying love that we imagined when we were a teenager. And they often make modern marriage scandals seem tame in comparison. A lot of the movies you see on television, they are just that, made for television. They're not really true to history. Then only in Western Europe and North America did the notion of free choice and marriage for love triumph as a cultural ideal. In the 19th century, most of Europeans and Americans came to accept a new view of husbands as providers and of wives as nurturing homebodies. Only in the mid-20th century, however, could a majority of families in Western Europe and North America actually survive on the earnings of a single breadwinner. In the 1950s, family then was not so new a development as we used to think. Rather, it was the culmination of a package of ideals about personal life and the male-female relations that emerged at the end of the 18th century and gradually became the norm across Western Europe and North America. These ideals gave people unprecedented opportunities to get more personal satisfaction from their marriages. But they also raised questions that posed a fundamental change to traditional ways of ordering society. If marriage, if marriage was about love and lifelong intimacy, why would people marry at all if they couldn't find true love? What would hold a marriage together if love and intimacy disappeared? How could household order be maintained if marriages were based on affection rather than male authority? No sooner had the ideal of the love match and lifelong intimacy taken hold than people began to demand the right to divorce. No sooner did people agree that families should serve children's needs than they began to find the legal penalties for illegitimacy inhumane. See what's going on? Are you guys listening closely? You see what happens? You see what's evolved over the last 150 years? Now I want you to stop and pause with me for a second. I want you to think now about all that you read in the Bible concerning marriage. And I want you to think about the true relationship even during scriptural times 2,000 years ago when Paul was writing and even when Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees about marriage. I want you to think about the fact that love even then was not the primary reason for marriage. Okay? And now I want you to think about in the commands of how a husband should treat a wife and how a wife should treat a husband, which we're going to go over all that in a little bit, or in a few hours, okay? Are y'all with me? It has a whole different light. You have pastors in churches and you have Christian leaders trying to teach people today what was written back then to a whole different concept of marriage. And we're trying to relate it to people today who are married for the sake of, I'm in love. When in reality it was written to people who were married for a whole different reason. Hello? That's why the Scripture says that the older women are to teach the younger women to love their husbands. Women didn't get married because they were in love. Hello? It does make more sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay. Are you beginning to get a whole different light on things now? Okay. You see, the whole idea of marriage initially was not so much about love and lust and all that kind of stuff. It was about responsibility. It was about survival in life on this planet Earth. We have evolved into a people of such prosperity and such luxury and such leisure that all of a sudden about 150 to 200 years ago, we arrived at a place to where even the most essential of responsibilities, and that is marriage, became something that we looked upon as it's all about me. Now, you see? The ultimate responsibility as a human being, even for Christians, became it's all about me. It's no longer about my commitment to society or my commitment to God as a Christian or my commitment to my partner in life. I'll call him that, husband or wife. In that sense, it's all about me and what I get out of it. You see the difference? You know, as long as you love me, I'm married to you. Hello? And that's why this problem of divorce has escalated for the last 150 years to the point that it's at now in this new millennium. You seeing a different light on things? That's why people are trying to teach scriptural admonition to a people who have no concept of what it's saying. Because it really is not applying. The problem with marriages today is really not as much about what Paul is instructing or correcting. The problem with marriage today is really selfishness. You see the difference? Well. Okay, listen here. Okay, so let me pick up where I left off. So no sooner do people agree that families should save children's needs than they begin to find the legal penalties for illegitimacy inhumane. Okay, so you see what's happening now? And so this is the problem now we have over abortion. This is the problem, as we're going to see, that we're having now about homosexuality. That's where all this came from, is the same place. What just happened here last month, or a month before last, on a Friday, when they legalized same-sex marriages, is the result of what we're talking about right now. It's where it came from. The right to choose, who you want to marry. It doesn't even have to be the opposite sex anymore. You can marry a frog now if you want to. Not literally, but that's coming. You watch. You watch. And down the road, pedophilia is coming. They're going to legalize, before it's over with, they will legalize marrying children. Okay? And there's no end to it, and it's all because of what we're talking about. I hope I'm making this clear. All of this is the product of the last 150 to 200 years of what our society would call deep love in marriage. Marrying who you love instead of traditionally what marriage was all about in reality. Okay, let me continue going along here. Some people demanded equal rights for women so they could survive economically without having to enter loveless marriages. But see, women survived wonderfully before love was even a part of marriage. But do you see what happened? Nobody has a problem with women having rights. You understand what I'm saying? But the idea is that when you open up a can of worms, before long, you got not only worms, you got snakes. You see? Others even argued for the decriminalization of homosexual love on the ground that people should be free to follow their hearts. There was a crisis over these questions in the 1790s, and another in the 1890s, and yet another in the 1920s. Then in the 1950s, everything seemed to calm down. More people than ever before embraced the ideals of love and marital companionship without following them to the dangerous conclusion that loveless marriages ought to end in divorce, or that true marital partnerships should be grounded in the equality of men and women. Still, even as people became convinced that they had at last created the perfect balance between individual desires and social stability, and even as virtually all North America and Western Europe finally embraced the marital model, it was on the verge of collapse. You know, they had this utopia in the 50s. You know, Ozzie and Harriet. You know what I'm saying? You know, My Three Sons. You remember those shows, you old people like me? You Leave It to Beaver. All those shows, you know, they had this utopia. And it was about 10 years, and all of a sudden the 60s came and everything went, whoop! Right? Free love. You remember that? And all of a sudden you started hearing about people getting divorced. And I remember in the 60s, I was a kid, but I remember people didn't talk a lot about divorce, but they started becoming more prevalent. I remember my best friend's parents divorced. And it was really like a tragic thing because they were real popular in the community, that couple was. And they divorced. And then in the 70s, you started hearing a lot more about divorce. And nowadays, it's like, divorce is no big deal. You know, it's just part of society these days. George Bernard Shaw described marriage as an institution that brings together two people under the influence of the most violent, most insane, most elusive, and most transient of passions. They are required to swear that they will remain in that excited, abnormal, and exhausting condition continuously until death do them part. You know? And that really is the concept. First of all, people have that concept of marrying for love now, which is absolutely unreasonable. Think about it. I mean, he's right. What he says right here. The vows that we require as ministers people to make based on what they think they're getting married for. You know, it's totally a fantasy. She thinks he's a knight in white shining armor, and she thinks he is the dreamboat, you know, I said that. She thinks he's the knight in white shining armor, and he thinks that she's his princess or something. Anyway, and both of them are getting married based on these illusions. Right? In the first place, somebody that's having an illusion is already out of their mind. Okay? And the only result is that sooner or later they're going to wake up and see the truth. And they're going to realize that they've married someone who is human like them. And marriage is full of challenges and it's full of effort and work. But this craziness has only been going on for 100 to 200 years. Prior to that, people got married with a realistic understanding that she's a woman and he's a man. And they both have responsibilities. And that's what they're getting married for. It was almost a business arrangement, more than anything. With the understanding, and they usually even had some type of a contract. At the very least, it might have been a verbal contract, but it was a contract. And usually negotiated by people other than themselves. And the agreement was that you will have children, which oftentimes, if children were not able to be conceived, oftentimes the marriage was annulled. But you will have children, and you will share certain lands or properties or valuables. You will, in other words, you'll exchange these things, which the two of you are becoming married, so you're together, but the family will exchange these things, and you'll become one family, and there are certain things that transpired. It was a business arrangement, basically. And if they ever fell in love, it usually took a while, sometimes years. And sometimes they never fell in love. And so they just had children, and they met each other's needs in whatever sense needs were. That's why the scripture was so clear to say that the husband and the wife are responsible to meet the sexual needs of each other. Because if you didn't get married because you love each other, you had no desire for each other. So therefore, the marriage covenant under the scripture requirement as a Christian was, you still have to meet each other's needs, so there won't be temptation out of marriage. And Paul said, if you have temptation, as far as sexual temptation, you know what I'm saying? If you're about to commit fornication, Paul says you need to marry somebody. Better to marry and burn. You know what? He never said anything about loving them. You know, I'm just telling you, he never said anything about loving them. He says better to marry than burn. I'm just saying. You never heard it like this before, have you? But you know what? We read into there. We always read into the scripture what was not there. We always read, you better find somebody to love real quick and marry him. Right? How many times have people divorced because, well, I couldn't help it. I've had people tell me this. I just didn't love my spouse anymore. And that's why I just couldn't sleep in the bed with him anymore. Because I just didn't love him anymore. So I started sleeping in the other room. And you know what Paul would have said? Big deal. That's what Paul would have said. Big deal. You're married to him. You owe him, or you owe her. See? But y'all are out there laughing because in this day and time, we've had such a twisted concept, placed in our mind. I know I grew up the same way. We've had this twisted concept put in our mind that it's all based on love. It's all based on feelings. I just don't feel it no more. I got to divorce them. It's not about feelings. It's about commitment. You have children. You have produced common property. You stay together for the property. Hello? You've already brought your families together. You're one family now. Your daddies are out there playing on that field together. They don't have two fields anymore. That's one field. Y'all see what I'm saying? We don't think about it like this, but that's how they thought about it. And you hear God in the background saying to this couple, if this is what they're thinking, let nothing put asunder. Why? Because it's not going to just tear you two apart. It's going to tear your daddies apart. It's going to tear your mamas apart. It's going to tear your babies apart. Why? It's going to tear everything apart. Hello? Think about it. That's interesting, isn't it? Okay. So in ancient India, here's some other cultures, okay? Are y'all enjoying this? Yes. It's weird, isn't it? Yes. You know why it's weird? Because we're weird. In ancient India, falling in love. Now, listen, I want to tell you, this ain't only ancient India, because I've done been to India several times. In India, they still have arranged marriages to this day. I asked a young man this morning, this in my class, his name is David, he's from Chennai. And I asked him, I said, when are you getting married? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, your parents haven't, they don't have someone for you? And he said, they have not chosen to pick anyone yet. I said, are they going to let you pick your own wife? He said, not necessarily, I don't know. But they still, normally they still do arrange marriages for most of them. In ancient India, falling in love before marriage was seen as a disruptive, almost antisocial act. The Greeks thought love sickness was a type of insanity, a view that was adopted by medieval commentators in Europe. In the Middle Ages, the French defined love as a derangement of the mind that could be cured by sexual intercourse, either with the loved one or with a different partner. I'm just reading to you, okay? I'm not making this up. This has come out of textbook, okay? This cure assumed, as Oscar Wilde once put it, that the quickest way to conquer yearning and temptation was to yield. Of course, these are pagan ideas, y'all understand? But this is what they believed. This was their idea of this kind of situation. Immediately, was to yield immediately and to move on to more important matters. In other words, love was not considered an important matter. Somebody in these societies during this time period who was being drawn by love was somebody who was totally out of their mind. And you just need to get that out of you real quick, move on to important matters. That was the way they felt about things. In China, excessive love between husband and wife was seen as a threat to the solidarity of the extended family. Parents could force a son to divorce his wife if her behavior or work habits didn't please them, whether or not he loved her. They could also require him to take a concubine if his wife did not produce a son, which that's common in a lot of cultures. If a son's romantic attachment to his wife rivaled his parents' claims on the couple's time and labor, the parents might even send her back to her parents. In the Chinese language, the term love did not traditionally apply to feelings between husband and wife. It was used to describe an illicit, socially disapproved relationship. In the 1920s, a group of intellectuals invented a new word for love between spouses because they thought such a radical new idea required its own special label. In Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries, adultery became idealized as the highest form of love among the aristocracy. According to the Countess of Champagne, it was impossible for true love to exert its powers between two people who are married to each other. In the 12th century, France, Andreas Capellanus, who was chaplain to Countess Marie of Troyes, wrote a treatise on the principles of courtly love. The first rule was that marriage is no real excuse for not loving. Okay. But he meant loving someone outside the marriage. Now he was the chaplain. As late as the 16th century, the French essayist Montaigne wrote that any man who was in love with his wife was not a man so dull that no one else could love him. Some Greek and Roman philosophers even said that a man who loved his wife with excessive ardor was an adulterer. Many centuries later, Catholic and Protestant theologians argued that husbands and wives who loved each other too much were committing the sin of idolatry. Theologians chided wives who used endearing nicknames for their husbands because such familiarity on a wife's part undermined the husband's authority and the awe that his wife should feel for him. So stop calling your husband honey. Okay? The Hindu tradition celebrates love and sexuality in marriage. But love and sexual attraction are not considered valid reasons for marriage. First we marry, then we'll fall in love is the formula. As recently as 1975, a survey of college students in the Indian state of Karnataka found that only 18% strongly approved of marriages made on the basis of love, while 32% completely disapproved. Pastor Chowala mentions George Washington was married without a marriage license. Of course, this is true. In fact, before the middle of the 19th century, no license was required to marry at all. Then, horror of horrors, some people started wanting to marry interracially. What a concept. Interracial marriages up until the point had been totally illegal. Then some states started to adopt marriage license, specifically for interracial couples, meaning that basically anyone could get married unless you had a different skin color. That, of course, required permission from the state. The reason any license throughout history has been instituted was so that it could be denied to some people. In the mid-1800s, this happened to be interracial couples. Then in 1923, the Uniform Marriage and Marriage License Act was passed by the federal government. 6 years later, marriage licenses were being distributed in every state to all people, not just interracial couples. Marriage had become a government institution. In other words, a way to tax people. Let me say that again, for clarity, marriage licenses have only existed on any significant scale since 1929. About 100 years now, or a little less. No one in the United States before that was required to have a marriage license in order to practice the fundamental right to marriage. Okay, so some interesting stuff, right? Just gives you a little bit of background from the world's perspective on how they viewed marriage and the kind of the history of marriage. We're going to take a look now at the history and practice of Christian marriage. Okay, and this is going to come to us more from a teaching outline. We're going to just see it from the biblical perspective, and a lot of it will be familiar to you. All righty. So let's begin on. Just going to read our contents here. So moonstruck partners pledging eternal love may be the current definition of marriage, but this starry-eyed picture has relatively modern origins. Through marriage. Though marriage has ancient roots, until recently love had very little to do with it. When we've talked about this, what marriage had in common was that it really was not about the relationship between the man and the woman. And of course, we've already been talking about what Stephanie Kuntz has written. And it's a way of getting in-laws, of making alliances, and of expanding the family labor force. But as family plots of land gave way to market economies and kings ceded power to democracies, the notion of marriage transformed. Now most Americans see marriage as a bond between equals that's all about love and companionship. We're going to look at the 5 myths about marriage here and just kind of see where we're at today. And we go from polygamy to same-sex marriage. Here are 13 milestones in the history of marriage. The first one is arranged alliances. So basically we already know this because we talked about it, but marriage is truly an ancient institution that predates recorded history, but early marriage was seen as a strategic alliance between families, with the youngsters often having no say in the matter. In some cultures, parents even married one child to the spirit of a deceased child in order to strengthen familiar bonds. In some cultures, there was always a requirement that the oldest child had to be married first. But if no one ever came courting, or if there was never a reach out to the oldest child, to create a marriage relationship or contract with the oldest child, nobody ever wanted to marry the oldest child, particularly a daughter. But someone was wanting to marry the second child. Sometimes what they would do is they would marry the oldest child, particularly a girl, off to a deceased boy who had never been married. And the reason they would do that was because, number one, it got her married, and she didn't have anybody coming for her. And number two, by marrying that deceased child, she would then connect her family to his family, and she would be able to, basically connect to his wealth, his lands, all the assets, as if the child were alive, even though she would not have a living husband. Do you all understand? In other words, again, it really was never about those two people. It was always about connecting two families. Do y'all follow me? And so that was real common, especially in a lot of Eastern countries, China, Japan, places like that. That was a real common thing. So it honored the dead child, the dead male, typically. It honored the dead child because now the dead child who died, typically he died as a child or as a young man before he had time to get married. It honored him by now giving him a wife. You remember we said earlier that a child or even a man was not recognized as an adult until they were married. Okay? Remember that? So if this child or this young man died before he was married, he was considered a dead child. He may have been 25 years old, see. But he was never looked upon by society as having reached respectable adulthood. So now when he marries, though he is dead, now he's seen as a respectable adult because now he's married. Now she is married, though she is a widow, and she's able to connect to his wealth, his family's wealth. You follow me? Okay? So this was often the case. Okay? Number 2, family ties. This is keeping alliances within the family was also quite common. In the Bible, the forefathers, Isaac, Jacob, married cousins, and Abraham married his half-sister. Cousin marriages remain common throughout the world today, particularly in the Middle East. In fact, Rutgers anthropologist Robin Fox has estimated that the majority of all marriages throughout history were between first and second cousins. That is still very common today, everywhere in the world except in the western part of the world. We joke about it, in the United States and in Western Europe. But actually, predominant parts of the world, they still prefer to marry within the family. And it's because it keeps the family strong. It keeps the family's wealth, in the family. It keeps the family's lands in the family. And typically, families like each other. Who was the first friend you had as a child? Probably your cousins. Yeah. In psychology, that's one of the first things they taught us, is that the majority of children's first friends were their cousins. And people, especially living in rural areas, grow up around their cousins. And they don't understand that if you get too close in the gene pool, you mess things up. They just fall in love with their cousins. And even though a lot of kids will not admit it, their first boyfriend or girlfriend was a cousin. You know, they're not going to admit it. When they get older, they'll lie and grit their teeth. But most of you fell in love with your cousin, you know. And that's just, it's human nature. And so that's how societies grew. And also, the further back you get in history, the fewer people there were on the earth. Hello? Jacob and Joseph and all those guys, you know, I mean, you know. Besides that, God told them, keep it in the tribe. Right? You know? And so you got a lot of reasons for understanding that. Okay? But there you have it. So number 2, polygamy was preferred in the past a lot. Monogamy may seem central to marriage today, but in fact, polygamy was common throughout history. From Jacob to Kings David and Solomon, biblical men often had anywhere from 2 to thousands of wives. Of course, though polygamy may have been an ideal that high-status men aspired to, for purely mathematical reasons, most men likely could only handle one wife. You know, it's expensive, you know, to have a lot of wives. But in few cultures, one woman married multiple men, and there have even been some rare instances of group marriages. But most cultures did embrace polygamy in the past, and polygamy is still, in some places today, like Utah. So it still happens, okay? And number 4, babies optional. In many cultures, men could dissolve a marriage to take another wife if a woman was infertile. However, the early Christian church was a trailblazer in arguing that marriage was not contingent on producing offspring. So, you know, you have that to consider. Monogamy established. Monogamy became the guiding principle for Western marriages sometime between the 6th and the 9th centuries. And really, what prompted this was the Scripture, but also the strength of the Catholic Church that helped bring this about. And then sixthly, the what we're calling here monogamy light. Still, monogamous marriage was very different from the modern concept of mutual fidelity. Though marriage was legally or sacramentally recognized between just one man and one woman, until the 19th century, men had wide latitude to engage in extramarital affairs. Kuntz said any children resulting from those trysts, however, would be illegitimate with no claim to the man's inheritance. It was common until, you know, the 1800s, early 1800s, for man can do what a man wanted to do.